Hello, I'm Max Keiser. Welcome to the 500th episode of the Keiser Report. 500 episodes of markets, finance, and scandal covering crimes against capital markets and economies, bail-ins, bailouts, and the bond apocalypse, flash crashes, London, Wales, and Obamacare, MF Global, Jefferson County, and Cyprus, manipulating metals, LIBOR, and Forex, vampire squids, and tapeworms. We've covered it all here on the Keiser Report. But aside from the bad and the ugly, we've also covered the good: silver, gold, and Bitcoin, the global insurrection against a bankster occupation, aka Giabo, move your money, and can't pay, won't pay. And the most interesting guest of all financial media, mainstream or alternative, and the best audience for sure. That's you, right, Stacy?
Yes, Max. And of course, 500 episodes of the Keiser Report. We have an audience out there, including, it looks like GCHQ or NSA. They've been forced out of the dark by Edward Snowden, and they have to a little bit more.
Go away, you NSA people. Look at that. They're trying to clean my ear. There we go.
We started the show in November of 2009. 4 years later, we're at the 500th episode. And, I'm going to go over some of the topics, the things that we've seen over these years and where we have arrived after 4 years of this show. Now, the most remarkable is the aftermath of the financial crisis in one graph. You see the blue line is financial profits are up 59% since the beginning of the financial crisis. The red is corporate profits, up 42%. Green is the S&P, and that is up 8%. And purple is employment, which is down 7%.
The crisis was created by over-financialization of the economy in the U.S. and around the world. That is to say that the business of the U.S. and the U.K. became the business of printing lots of bonds and then manipulating those bonds using derivatives. That's how the derivatives market got to be 600 trillion in size on a global GDP of about 60 trillion. Then you had the crash of 2008, which was a crash of financialization and securitization. To get out of that crash, the government decided, along with the Treasury and the Federal Reserve Bank, to increase financialization, which increased the profits of the people who caused the crash to begin with. And as we've said on this show all along, Stacy, people are not needed in an economy where the top 200 or 300 people can just get money for free from the Fed. Similar to Saudi Arabia, they don't need the citizens in Saudi Arabia. They just pump more oil, and there's incredible poverty in Saudi Arabia. In America now, there's incredible poverty because the people are not needed. Their jobs are not needed. Their tax revenues are not needed because the Bank of America, the Federal Reserve Bank, just prints money, and therefore it just creates this huge wealth and income gap.
Actually, I'm going to skip ahead to a headline I have there because you mentioned the derivatives, use of derivatives as a form of wealth confiscation and wealth transfer schemes. The typical American family makes less than it did in 1989. In 1989, the median American household made $51,681 in current terms. That means that 24 years ago, a middle-class American family was making more than a middle-class family was making more than a year ago, which is $51,107. Now, if you look at the chart, you could see the past 25 years that it rose under, the median income rose under Clinton. But then what happened at the end of Clinton administration, Max? We had the repeal of Glass-Steagall, and we had the Commodities Futures Trading Act, which enabled derivatives to go global.
They had the reclassification of derivatives as gambling instruments to legitimate instruments of finance as part of the global financialization of the economy. Most corporations, by the way, are in the business of finance. They're in the business of lending. Famously, GMAC, General Motors Acceptance Corporation, makes most of the money not for that. GM not making cars. Okay, that's just one example. There are many examples. But just take a look in the last 10 years is what happened to one portion of the American population, the black population. They were told to buy houses under Bush. They then got caught up in the subprime scandal, which was a manufactured crisis. They've had the biggest wealth confiscation in their history, going back to slave days. And they are now feeding into America's prison system, which is owned by the same financialization, the same securitization, the same banks on Wall Street. So the black Americans have gone from slave to middle class, back to essentially imprisonment, and that's all served the purposes of the top 1% of financializationizers.
So you mentioned 1%, and of course the 99% movement, the Occupy Wall Street, happened since we began the show, and we've covered that. We were right there covering Occupy Wall Street from the very beginning. Now, here's a headline from Forbes on the 2-year anniversary of that. Give back? Yes, it's time for the 99% to give back to the 1%. And they say, imagine the effect on our culture, particularly on the young, if the kind of fame and adulation bathing Lady Gaga attached to the more notable achievements of, say, Warren Buffett. Or if the moral praise showered on Mother Teresa went to someone like Lloyd Blankfein, who in guiding Goldman Sachs towards billions in profits has done infinitely more for mankind.
Right. Well, this is market fundamentalism. Just like America is now hiring al-Qaeda in Syria to make way for a pipeline for Saudi Arabia, then Forbes magazine points to a financial terrorist like Warren Buffett, who's in the securitization business, financialization business, who has done more to destroy the American economy than almost anyone except for Lloyd Blankfein. They've all been caught engaged in massive fraud. They've had to pay small civil fines as part of rigging the judicial system and the legal system with the money they make in this financialized Ponzi scheme. And Forbes magazine is a shameless promoter of market fundamentalism or market terrorism.
This is an article that's an opinion piece, a commentator, an outside commentator who posted this on there. He's an Ayn Rand fanatic. So he's looking at the profits, the so-called profits that Lloyd Blankfein has stolen from the rest of the population through fraudulent mortgage-backed securities, through front-running markets, through high-frequency trading. And he's saying that this is, in an absolute objectivist, fundamentalist way, that the profits are all that matters. And the fact that he stole it from you, from your granny, tough luck. That's capitalism and his version of it.
Right. Well, we've seen this with other fascist regimes. As the wealth confiscation gets more pronounced, those who are doing the stealing, whether it's the Nazis in the 30s or Warren Buffett in the 2013 period, they scapegoat the losers. So the losers are being scapegoated. I've already mentioned the black community in America is being imprisoned at record amounts. The prison population in America is the fastest growing population. The prison population in absolute terms is higher than any other country in the world. And that's Forbes is assisting in this scapegoating and pretty soon prisons become concentration camps and they become extermination camps. That's the final solution to the debt bomb created by the Federal Reserve Bank. Mark my words, you'll see it in America in the next 5 years.
The other thing that we've been covering is the global insurrection against banker occupation. But of course, nothing has been able to stop the rise of the bankster class. As we see in the numbers that we've just covered, the median household income is down. The wealth and profits of the financial sector is up. Lehman's legacy of inequality, James Saft of Reuters. When Lehman went down 5 years ago, it set in train forces which could easily have led to the failure of many financial institutions. Faced with the possibility of taking large swathes of the banking system into effective government control, first the Bush and later the Obama administrations chose instead to shelter institutions and executives from the consequences of their actions. That involved creating a variety of policies which subsidized large banks and helped to dig a moat around the businesses. This went hand in hand, he said, with monetary policy, and put this in the context of the guy who wrote a commentary on Forbes.com where he's saying that Lloyd Blankfein's profits make him a holier than the 99%, when, as James Saft on Reuters is pointing out, is government policy, it's manipulation through the Fed that has built a moat around Goldman Sachs and enabled them to profit at the expense of everybody else.
Right. Well, this is a failure of a market signal due to market fundamentalism. The collapse of Lehman was a market signal that should have alerted the government and everyone participating in these markets that their massive reform was needed. But instead, they interpreted that market signal as a way to make the situation much worse. Again, I make the comparison to theocratic, fanatical religious extremists who misread their fundamentalist texts, and everything they read suggests that they should blow themselves up and other people. Same thing with Lloyd Blankfein and Warren Buffett. Everything they read says, I should blow everything up. I should commit mass terrorism. That's the message that they get from the price signals that they receive. It's a breakdown in capitalism, unfortunately, and it's predictable because, unfortunately, the price of money is close to zero and access to money is ubiquitous by the kakistocracy in America, ruled by the least qualified, not to mention the kleptocracy on Wall Street.
This is, again, what they point out is that there's a huge subsidy that has emerged in the last 5 years. Since we started doing the Keiser Report, there's a massive subsidy in that these banks, Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, any of the other surviving banks, they know, the investors know that they have a guaranteed subsidy, is that the government will bail them out no matter what. And he points out we also have an effective subsidy, or rather multiple subsidies, to an industry which has proved itself remarkably immune to the power of technology to bring down costs and improve products, despite what the guy on Forbes said is not bringing innovation and efficiency to our economy. It's actually slowing it down. It's gunking up the wheels of capitalism.
Well, high-frequency trading, which is a technological innovation in finance, is used to steal money from the New York Stock Exchange. You put a computer co-located next to the floor of the stock exchange. Algorithmically, you front-run trades on the exchange, and that money goes into the pockets of banks like Goldman Sachs with zero risk. That's siphoning cash from the economy at zero risk. So naturally, people are increasing the rate of poverty. There's an increase in rate of poverty in America if you have a bank that's actually got a computer parked next to the exchange that's siphoning off the money, then you're going to have a lot of poverty out there. And of course, you have to add, let's scapegoat the people that we're victimizing to make it a true fascist trifecta. Thank you, Lloyd Blankfein.
So finance went from 15% of GDP in 1980 to 22% today. And so they're too big to fail. They're able to get away with massive crimes. And why are they able to? Why are they able to scapegoat people? And part of it is the media, because you can't have these crimes without propaganda. And I saw a tweet this past week from Dennis Neal of Fox Business. And he says, hey guys, another day, another fine on JP Morgan. What's bugging me? Tweet us. Is the government's assault on JP Morgan going too far? It's the government assault on JP Morgan, not the JP Morgan's assault on the American population, the global population, through LIBOR rate rigging, through municipal bond rate rigging, through the collapse of Jefferson County, through the front running of markets, through manipulation of silver, gold, energy markets. No.
JP Morgan, financial terrorist, embraced by Fox and CNBC, just like they now embrace Al-Qaeda to fight their wars in Syria. You know, 12 years ago, Al-Qaeda was bad. Oh, 9/11 blew up. Oh, they're bad. Now they're a lovely friends. We want them to run the. I'm not surprised they don't hire one of these guys to run the bank, the Federal Reserve Bank. Just go out and hire a terrorist outright. Drop the facade. Hire a jihadist to run the Federal Reserve Bank of America, Warren Buffett. You've got influence. All right, Stacy Herbert, thanks so much for being on this very special 500 episode of the Keiser Report.
500 more, Max.
All right, stay tuned for the second half, a whole lot more. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. With this 500th episode of Markets, Finance, and Scandal, time now to go to Ecuador and speak with Professor Steve Keen, who was on our 4th episode of the Keiser Report. So it's time to check in with Professor Keen. Welcome back to the Keiser Report, sir.
Max, delighted to be here. Delighted this is still the most popular show on finance and growing around the planet.
Professor Keen, it's been 5 years since Lehman Brothers collapsed. Are we any better off today? Is the financial system more stable?
No way, no way. The great tragedy of this is that this should have been a final stop blowing the debt bubble, and I mean private debt primarily, message for the global economy when the crash happened. And because the politicians have become so locked up in the belief that you can't have a viable economy unless you've got a large financial sector, they spent their time reviving the financial parasite rather than reviving the economy the parasite had actually brought to its knees. So, in fact, we've now got ourselves back on another unsustainable trend, probably of rising private debt in America for quite a while. England, the same sort of thing with that ludicrous help to sell policy they've got, causing yet another bubble over there. The same apparently happening in Australia, courtesy simply of low interest rates. So we're back blowing bubbles once more, and the system is much more fragile because it's carrying a much larger level of dead weight than it was before the last crisis began.
Okay, now you mentioned something there that Stacy and I talked about in the first half, is that the Lehman Brothers collapse is a price signal. And if the capitalist system were working normally, that signal would have been interpreted as we need to reform the system. But instead, that price signal was interpreted as we need to double down again on fraud, correct?
I think it's correct. And it's really, I blame the private sector for this bubble. but I blame the public sector for not doing what it should have done and saying, well, you guys, I could use French, I'd use a word starting with F and ending with D, the economy, and it's now time you paid the price for doing it. You're where you wiped out, your bond holders go, your equity holders go, and we're going to put Bill Black on you and put quite a few in jail for fraud because clearly they had to be involved in what you did. None of that happened. They became totally psychophantic for the financial system. So Galbraith used to talk about a military-industrial complex taking over America. I think what actually happened is a politico-financial complex has taken over, not just America, but the entire planet.
You mentioned that you blame the private sector more than the public sector. The public sector, of course, being the government. Now, when you hear debate about this on the mainstream media, you see or you hear a lot of finger pointing. So the private sector will say, look, we wouldn't be engaged in this massive fraud if the public sector or the government didn't allow us to engage in this fraud. In other words, if you want us to stop, then you need to pass laws to stop us. Then the government or the Federal Bank, Reserve Bank in Washington will say, well, we can't stop the fraud because if we do, it'll cause a problem in the private sector. All the banks will collapse, so we have to keep the fraud going with artificially low interest rates and quantitative easing and keep this Ponzi scheme going. So there's this finger pointing. By the way, everyone in government is getting fabulously rich. Everyone in Congress has participated, trading on insider information. The net worth of the average congressman, senator, everyone in the administration has doubled, tripled, quadrupled. The bankers in the private sector, same thing. Their net worths have doubled, tripled, quadrupled. Everyone's making money in this unholy alliance, this fascist alliance between government and Wall Street. And the one holding the bag, of course, are the average person who's not part of the kleptocracy, but they believe they are participating through the housing market, particularly here in Britain, where George Osborne believes that by reinflating the speculative housing bubble, he will bring social equanimity back to the economy of Britain. Is this a good idea, Professor Steve Keen?
It's long-term. It'll work in the short term. And this is a great tragedy, Max, because, as you say, it's obviously the politicians and the financiers that made the biggest bundle out of this crisis, where when the private sector gets sucked up by a housing bubble, they think they're getting better off. Because only those who've got houses have already got into the game are coming out ahead. What you get is social division coming out of this. And ultimately, that leads to social breakdown as well. So it's a short-term tactic. It fools you for a while, and then it collapses in a heap at a later stage, and we're back in the same bloody cycle again. So it is a great tragedy that a chance to reform the financial fraud of capitalism was turned into a way to make more money out of the financial fraud of capitalism and to even further embolden the financiers in the process.
Well, we've seen over the past 10 to 15 years a global bubble and bust economy driven by low interest rates. We had the Asian financial crisis. We had the dot-com blow up. We had long-term capital management. We had the housing bubble, subprime bubble and burst. Now we're into what looks to be a sovereign bond, government bond bubble. But there is a rotating musical chairs of bubble and bust. And we've talked before about the real estate market in Australia and the real estate market in Canada. It looks like Mark Carney's old country, Canada, is either right in the middle of or about to experience a major real estate collapse. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's still got a bit further to go, Max. The bubble looks like it's got a bit of extra legs to me. Last time I looked at the debt, the mortgage debt numbers, they were still driving prices up. But when you look at the level they've reached, Canada's now gone from being a low debt country in mortgages to a medium to high debt country in mortgages, and you always have a bust at some point. They can rescue it again as they've rescued the American bubble. That's now rising once more, but you have to have a crash. And they certainly have. I was in Toronto a short while ago, and it's skyscraper and crane country. So in the sense of having developers that massively overcommitted and all competing to be the first guys to open the front door, and hoping that they won't be the last one who then have to open the door to the bank instead. I think a bust is likely there, but it may be delayed another year.
Okay, let's talk about one of your favorite economists, Hyman Minsky. And I should point out your book, Debunking Economics, is a must-read for anyone who wants to get a good picture, a good view on exactly all the dimensions that are contributing to this massive global fraud. But let's talk about Hyman Minsky for a second, because Hyman Minsky, of course, the Minsky moment is something that he came up with, and it has to do with a self-referring bubble mentality. So we see it right now in the UK. Because house prices are up, the people who are part of the bubble believe it's due to their own ingenuity and ingenious behavior. They buy into the bubble. This is part of the Minsky moment, this self-referential, what I call financial narcissism, where it becomes patently obvious that the bubble must be real because I'm part of the bubble. And this is part of what it contributes to. And there's different levels and there's different parts of the Minsky moment cycle. I'm wondering if you could review that for a moment so we can have an idea of where the UK is now in this delusion.
Well, that's a good way of putting it, Max, because one thing Minsky spoke about at great length was what he called euphoric expectations. And he said if you have a capitalist economy, it's always going to be cyclical. There'll be booms, there'll be busts, even without adding the finance sector on top. When you do add the finance sector on top, people get in a boom, they borrow too much money. They've got to repay some of it during a slump, so the economy slows down. Unless it's totally a terminal slump like the Great Depression, or if the government comes in and does this ridiculous bailout the financial sector like they've done this time round, the economy ultimately starts to stabilise. Because it starts to stabilise, people start to forget the previous crisis, so they're willing to borrow money once more. So the bubble starts taking off once more. And once it does, what's actually driving the economy up is the rising level of debt. And everybody who's profiting by selling assets on a rising market caused by rising debt, as you say, financial narcissism, they think it's all their genius that does it. It's really the fact that everybody's borrowing money and buying second-hand houses off each other that drives the prices up. So you get to the stage where they're completely euphoric and they go for absolutely total overreach. And in the overreach, of course, many of the projects they take on are actually losing money. And then what happens, once they start to lose money, they've got to borrow money to stave off bankruptcy. And they can keep on doing it, but one of these days it's going to be for someone who goes slightly too long, they miss one payment and bang, they're bankrupt and the whole thing comes crashing down once more. And that's the world that the politicians in the financial sector are giving us, rather than the one of the 1960s when we were talking about taking off to the moon in rocket ships. We're now taking off to the moon in debt.
Yeah, I saw an interesting statistic today, and I will quote this, paraphrase it a bit, but the house price, the average house price in the UK is increasing by £100 a day, whereas the average median income in the UK is roughly 80 pounds a day, excuse me. But you see right there a huge disparity. The house prices are moving up quite a bit more rapidly than what people are being paid on a daily basis. Additionally, I saw an interesting statistic that said that in the UK, over the past several years, you've got your $10,000 that you have in the bank has lost purchasing power down to the 8,000 pound level, just over 8,000 pounds. So once again, they say there's no inflation. They say they need to keep interest rates low. They say the housing market is not a bubble, and yet the average person is losing purchasing power. They're not participating in the bubble, and they're creating social unrest. So this is a recipe for, I guess, either A, societal collapse or societal upheaval. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, the trouble about society these days is we're nowhere near as organised as we used to be back in the 1930s and 40s, because if this stuff that happened back then, when you had strong trade unions and militancy in the working class, and you also had less social security, you couldn't afford to put up with it. People would be on the streets and you'd actually see political demonstrations against it. These days, in some ways, social security, though it's vital, is masked over that level of political revulsion that people should have at what's happening right now, so they don't get organised and the politicians continue getting away with it. The outcome ultimately, I think, is more like turning Japanese without the benefit of being Japanese. So you start getting a stagnant economy, because this process can only work for a short while before it falls back into another slump. And you then have years and years and possibly decades of slow growth, meaning people can't get into the workforce in the first place. They certainly can't buy a house if they're not already a homeowner. And you then get a depressed society. A congenital depression, I think, is more the outcome, rather than an explosive reaction to it. I would like to see the explosive reaction, but the trouble is, normally when those things come, they don't come from the people, they come from a fascist movement. And I think we're more and more likely to see that happen over time. And frankly, this is the same way Hitler came to power back in the 1930s. It just happened faster back then.
Right. Well, we're already seeing it in Greece with the rise of the neo-fascist party challenging the IMF and other financial terrorists. Now, I know you're working down in Ecuador at the moment, Steve Keen. So your thoughts on emerging markets, how have they done in the past 5 years into this debt crisis? And we've got about a minute left.
Yeah, they don't. Some of the emerging markets themselves appear to be getting back into a bubble again. Certainly China is in a bubble, but it has more of a capacity with the state's finances and its trade surplus to keep that bubble going indefinitely. So I wouldn't gamble on this one. Ecuador, I actually find a pretty interesting, progressive country, very aware of this sort of stuff and trying to stop themselves being taken over by the financial sector and doing a lot of attempts to build innovative, genuine capitalism down here rather than the fraudulent stuff that's running in the West. So there are some glimmers of hope in the emerging markets, but let's not gamble on them. Let's get back to being a really productive industrial capitalist society one of these days.
All right. Well, Steve Keen, thanks for visiting us on our 500th episode. You were there on our 4th episode. We've been tracking your work, your career now for a number of years, and it's great to have you back on the Keiser Report.
Great to still be in touch with you guys. I love you both dearly.
And that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. I'd like to thank our guest, Professor Steve Keen, author of Debunking Economics. If you'd like to contact us, tweet us at Keiser Report. And we're looking forward to another 500 more episodes for you. Until next time, Max Keiser saying bye, y'all.